if you were to talk to somebody who said they want to go into academia right now, and I realize this might be a loaded question in a sense, but what might you say to them?
Man, I'm not sure that the universities as they are, I don't know that they're the future. I think, with the rise of AI, with the problematic behaviors we've seen from academia, the adoption of critical theory and all this rubbish. So I think what would need to change is employers saying, look, we no longer value the university degree, the bachelor's degree as Google or Apple or whatever business you are. It doesn't mean anything to us anymore. The power that universities have, they are the main credentialing system for employment. As soon as they lose that power, meaning businesses say, look, we can't trust you guys anymore. You're not credentialing the right people because you're so ideologically driven. You're not teaching them anything that's useful. So when we, as Google or Apple, we hire this person with a bachelor's degree, like they don't know anything. So we are going to just, I don't know, run apprenticeship programs or some other form of education where we just get the kids right out of high school and see you later, universities. Your time is gone.
Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote Podcast.
Dr. James Nuzzo, welcome to the CTA Podcast. It's good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
James, I've thought about a number of ways of actually starting this podcast, including while we were talking just off air. You kind of came across to us, or like we became aware of you, and I don't know if you're aware of this, in two different ways. One is through our own Carol Sherwood, who I believe John Barry of the Center for Male Psychology reached out about your story. But a month prior, our friends over at the Tin Men had already reached out about a paper that you had written as well. And before I kind of jump the gun and get ahead of myself, let me just introduce you for folks that are listening. Dr. James Nuzzo, you are an exercise scientist and men's health researcher. You've published over 80 research papers in peer-reviewed journals, and you write regularly on these topics related to men's health generally, gender differences, which I know we're going to get into a little bit today. Most recently, what came across for us was woke nomenclature. But if you can, James, tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background. How'd you find yourself in these kind of niche spaces?
Yeah, it's been an interesting evolution. So I currently live in Perth, Western Australia. I'm a dual citizen of the US and Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Grew up in Pennsylvania, moved around in the US a little bit, and then I've been in Australia since 2013, and I moved here to do a PhD in physiology. So my background is in exercise physiology or exercise science. And what's happened is, as a result of some of the stuff we're going to talk about with all the woke stuff happening and it sort of coming into all these different spaces like exercise science, I have started to transition a little bit or kind of evolve and talk now a little bit more about, I guess, men's health, public health, issues within academia from kind of a broader perspective. I still maintain that exercise science profile to a certain degree, but I now encompass a lot of other topics. And to be honest, the other topics are the ones that people are interested to hear my views on. They're the ones, for example, that you would have come across, the Tin Men. So it's not necessarily the exercise science stuff that I put out that's grabbing people's attention. It's some of these other things I think we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the more interesting elements of our first conversation that really occurred to me during that conversation was that you kind of found yourself in this space. It wasn't like you were aiming to go into the let's talk about woke space or let's talk about necessarily the hot topic of the day that's going on in academia. It's almost like you were, I don't want to say forced there, but by way of events, it seems like that kind of was the case. But before we even get there, maybe taking a step back, what got you interested in exercise science to begin with?
Well, as a kid, I was just always involved in sports. In rural Pennsylvania, there's not a whole lot to do other than play sports. So that's what I did. And I got really fascinated with the idea of kind of off-season training for sports. So how can you, in the off-season, kind of maximize your own physiology so that when game number one comes around, you are ready to go and you're going to have a great season. So I got really fascinated in weight training. I was introduced to that in high school, and that was what then eventually led to me studying exercise science for my bachelor's. And I got involved in competitive powerlifting when I was at university, and then I started to study kind of the science of strength training. And initially, it was more for sports performance or strength and conditioning for athletes. But then that evolved into more kind of basic stuff of, like, my PhD was about how does strength training impact the way that our brain and nerves communicate with our muscles to make our muscles stronger. So it started in a very specific focused area, kind of like sports science, and then it's kind of grown out to be broader and have more implications for, I guess, neurological impairments and aging and stuff like that. But that was never necessarily my original intention when I was studying that stuff. And now it's like we just said, it's grown even bigger, getting more into just public health and epidemiology.
When you're describing it, I was thinking back to like any phys ed that I had in my college days, or even in grad school, to the degree that it showed up. Things like innervation, things like action potentials, that kind of terminology was going through my mind. What's interesting is you didn't just study it; you lived it. I mean, so it's like you had these early experiences, in the realm of sports, but then also competitive powerlifter later on. And then you're studying this stuff. You're looking at things specifically related to strength, if I'm hearing you right. And at what point did you kind of switch into, because I think one of the first things I read of yours, although the first thing that was sent to me was actually your work on woke nomenclature, and I want to return back to that. But as I was reading through some of your work, the thing that seemed like that stood out as seemingly contentious, and I know we already talked about this once before when we first met, was things related to sex differences and grip strength. Can you tell me a little bit about your work in that area and how you even ended up looking into that area?
Yeah, well, it even starts earlier than that. So it start around the time I was finishing my PhD, at the end of 2016 and early 2017. And what got a lot of this kicked off, it's probably the most fundamental thing that's led to this different trajectory, is that the major professional body in the US that is associated with exercise science, so that kind of controls the curricula of exercise science programs in the US. It's a group called the American College of Sports Medicine, or the ACSM. And around the time I was finishing my PhD and transitioning to postdoc work in neurophysiology of exercise, the ACSM published a consensus or position paper about the concept of equity in physical activity. And this was, for me, the first signs of, so I think that paper was maybe published in 2016, give or take a year. And to me, that was the first sign. And this is kind of the early days of the woke stuff, but I had previously done a lot of my own reading off to the side to be aware of what was happening and what was coming, although I never expected it to blow up like it did in the years after that. So I actually pushed back against that concept of equity in physical activity, which basically the idea is you look at people based on their group identities. And when you do that, you find that not all demographic groups have the same participation rates in physical exercise. Therefore, public health programming must focus on creating equal levels of physical activity participation between groups. Rather than just simply trying to get everyone more physically active, we're now going to be obsessed with group identity. And one of those group identity characteristics is sex or gender. So I pushed back on the whole concept, but also on the concept related to sex and gender, because what it did is it said, moving forward, we really need to focus on women and girls and women and getting them more active. And I said, wait a minute. Yeah, I'm all for that. But let's not forget about how important sports and physical activity is to boys and men. You don't just all of a sudden stop caring about them. There were many other issues in that narrative, but it was through pushing back on that in the academic literature that I got familiar with the life expectancy difference between men and women. I I became familiar with the whole social construction narrative about this is why women don't participate in sports or physical activity as much because of social construction and things like that. So that was the initial step to get me into all this stuff. And that includes the more recent research on sex differences in grip strength starting from birth and all the rest of it. And I'm happy to go into more details if you want, but that's kind of the timeline of events there.
Yeah, so 2016, you're really kind of getting exposed to this stuff. There's now this language of equity, which I think as time has unfolded, has become pretty clear that it's about achieving a certain outcome, namely an equality outcome that isn't merely equality. It's whether by virtue of representation or by virtue of actual outcomes, which in some cases are impossible to achieve. You're
Yep.
getting exposed to this, and you have kind of like a side understanding of what's going on. You're paying attention to it, but really not having any sense for where that's going. And then, so I mean, what kind of things were they saying in terms of achieving equity at the time? Do you recall what kind of stood out to you from the time?
Yeah, well, one of the main problems with this idea was they were putting forward the idea of equity in physical activity to
Hmm.
achieve what they called health equity, meaning equal outcomes in health. But what was so problematic from the sex gender standpoint is that what are you talking about in terms of health equity? Because if you're using life expectancy as that final measure of whether or not there's kind of an equal outcome, then you've got the whole story wrong because on average, men are dying, like 5 years earlier. So if you want to say that you want to use physical activity participation as a way to improve health or equal outcomes in health, then on the sex gender question, you should actually be focusing more on boys and men. But that did not fit their narrative. And so what my critique was all about, which I published in the academic literature, I said, your ideas don't make any sense. Like when it comes to this sex gender thing, if you actually want to create equal outcomes, well, you should consider life expectancy. And if you do that, you shouldn't actually be focusing on the girls and women. You should focus more on the boys and men. I was just pointing out the internal contradictions in their position, which they never thought of because they don't think about boys and men's health. And there were numerous other issues with that whole concept that they were trying to put forward. And one is this idea that you think you can socially engineer perfectly all demographic groups to kind of be equal. But the reality is, even if you are successful in, let's say, creating equal levels between races, for example, in the process of doing that, you're likely to create another quote unquote inequity somewhere else. You're never going to be able to perfectly control this stuff. And that's what they're just absolutely obsessed with.
It's plugging a hole in a ship and thinking that it's not going to displace the pressure elsewhere, like that it's not going to somehow have some downstream effect. But to your point, their entire epistemological worldview precludes them from actually thinking that far down. They're thinking in terms of whatever, if I'm understanding you right. And some prior knowledge here, I've seen this throughout the literature and other areas, psychology included. It's not a long game, exactly, precisely. I mean, even the way you described it, what it sounded like to me initially was we're going to equalize the amount of representation we have in the sports, but at the same time, the issue that they're trying to address has to do with health outcomes. But you're pointing out that there's a lifespan discrepancy between men and women. And so by that logic, you would probably assume that they'd want to include more men into
That's right.
sports if sports are a metric for health outcomes. But they're not aiming for that, which kind of says a lot about what they're probably aiming for. Do we have to make assumptions, or was it pretty clear from the way they were talking about it at the time?
So one thing they didn't do was define what they mean by health equity, and that's part
Mm-hmm.
was part of the problem. So for me, I think the first thing you go to is life expectancy. I think that's sort of a safe sort of starting point. And let's be honest, they will use life expectancy as an outcome of interest when it benefits their particular narrative. But in this case, because it is men that kind of have the quote unquote disadvantage when it comes to life expectancy, they completely ignore it.
Mm.
So, yeah, that's where I called them out on the contradiction. We know that physical activity will improve your quality of life and lifespan if you participate. But yeah, if we want to start talking about using it as a vehicle to improve like a health outcome, I start at life expectancy and go from there.
So poorly defined in the first place, but then also using like as if sports is the only metric by which to evaluate health, sports inclusion or sports equity or something along those lines. It sounds like the fact that it was pointed at an ill-defined metric even led to kind of ill-defined interventions in a sense that were being proposed, if I'm hearing you right.
Yeah. And it wasn't just specific to sports participation. It was basically type of physical activity
Any type of
participation.
physical activity. I see.
Yeah. So even if it was, I don't know, like after hours school programs or something like that, it wasn't just about sports. And yeah, so if your listeners are interested, I published two things on that topic. One was an initial letter to the editor in the ACSM's journal, so that was published. And then because that was limited to 500 words for a letter, I then subsequently wrote a full critique, which is published in a journal called Sports Medicine, which is one of the highest ranked journals in the field. And the title of that paper is called Equity in Physical Activity, a Misguided Goal. And there was some additional letter exchanges. So a couple of equity advocates, I think from like Canada and the UK came at me, and then I came back at them. And so it was a lively debate. And it just further to me showed how entrenched these individuals are with their ideology. And they just really don't like being challenged and shown the sort of internal contradictions in their own thoughts.
I can see you tumbling down the rabbit hole here as you're talking about it, and almost like you're having this exchange with them, and it's almost like you're making them sweat, and because you're willing to challenge them in an academic or public domain, and over time you are having exchanges. How is this building across time? How did we end up getting to like an area where you're starting to look into, let's say, like grip strength between boys and girls?
Yeah, well, so then you sort of get into this narrative of, well, the reason that sex differences in strength and different kind of physical parameters exist is because girls are treated differently than boys, and boys are more encouraged to participate in sports. And if only we gave more media attention to women's sports, if only we gave more money toward girls and women's sports, then we would realize that it's all socially constructed. So that is a narrative that exists in the more kind of radical, kind of feminist circles that are coming in to exercise science. The problem is, if you actually look at data the way that I have, it suggests that there are pre-pubertal sex differences in various physical parameters. We have a ton of data on grip strength. It's the most commonly measured muscle strength measurement that we have. And one of the good things about it is that we have data going back decades, at least into the 1950s. And we have it at various ages, including a few studies that measure it within the first 48 hours of birth. So I published a large meta-analysis on all the data we have, and it shows that indeed, prior to puberty, there is a small but significant sex difference in grip strength. And then at puberty, then it just accelerates more. And one of the other neat things about this, or interesting things, is I published a follow-up paper, which is every strength measure we have. So not just grip strength anymore, but from the quadriceps, from the biceps muscles, everything we have. And what it shows is what is consistent in adults, which is the sex difference in strength is greater in its difference in upper body muscles than in lower body muscles. So the sex difference in strength in adults still exists in the lower body muscles, but it's much smaller than in the upper body muscles. The reason for this is because of differences and similarities in muscle mass. So basically, the sex difference, a large component of the sex difference in strength has to deal with where the differences in muscle masses lie. So men and women are much more similar in their lower bodies than they are in their upper bodies. And the neat thing about this second meta-analysis that we did was that we saw that this difference even exists in prior to puberty, where the sex differences exist in strength in both the lower and upper body, but the upper body differences are even greater than the lower body, even before puberty.
And so that completely, it's thrown in the face of their social constructivist paradigm where things are socially mediated, where there's some sort of, social determinism that's taking place here. And all we have to do is we have to reorient our interventions towards young girls prior to puberty or even at puberty, train them up, and they'll be equivalent to their male counterparts. Was that essentially the assertion?
Yep. And this also, so one other reason why I got into this space is the whole transgender sports stuff that's happening. And there was a paper that was published that essentially said that, well, if you if you give the hormonal treatments to the boys prior to them reaching puberty, then you're not going to see any difference after that. But that's based on an assumption that prior to puberty, there's no sex difference in physical performance. And what I've shown is that that's just untrue. The difference is already there. I mean, it's smaller than after puberty, but it's in grip strength, it is very, very consistent. Every single year of development, you can see that the magnitude of that difference remains about the same until age 10. At age 11, the sex difference in grip strength actually becomes smaller. It's still greater in boys, but the reason that it becomes smaller is because girls hit puberty prior to boys on average. So for about a year, girls kind of catch up to boys a little bit. But then year 12 and then so on, you just start to see this accelerated difference. And that really, really points to a biological basis for this sex difference in strength.
As I've seen this conversation unfold over the last couple of years, I've heard a lot of people try and cite differences in bone density and muscle density, and just, overall strength, throughout the lifespan. But you actually took a deep dive into the literature going back to the mid 1900s. Why aren't these individuals taking a look at this data? What is precluding them from? It's like the way you're describing it, and maybe I'm just beating a dead horse here, is like they have blinders on, and that the aperture that they're looking at it just like it completely ignores this information you're looking at as extraneous. It doesn't count for some reason. What do you make of that?
Well, in terms of the historical data, I think one thing we have a real problem with in training up kind of young academics is they just do not even know the historical archives of the journals that are closely related to their field. So I just see this over and over again in exercise science. And yeah, it creates actually some other problems too, which is people are doing studies that were done like 35 years ago. But because they don't open up an academic journal published prior to 2005, they have no idea. Like we've had so much of this data over the years, but they sort of, it's almost like a sort of disrespect of history. They for some reason think that because a study was done in 1966, for some reason, we're so much better now. Well, actually, I mean, in some cases, yes, the quality of work now is better, but sometimes it is much better back then because they weren't inflicted with sort of the woke mind virus and so many other things. So it's sort of like a lack of effort, really. I mean, in the journal Research Quarterly, which is where I pulled a lot of that historical information on boys and girls grip strength, they're just the academics in my field are just uninterested or unaware that those archives even exist. They
Mm.
don't know. No one ever teaches them about them. Like other professors don't know, and so those professors then don't teach their students. So when those students become professors, they don't know. So it's just a lack of, I don't know. It's sort of a lack of passion for history and one's own field.
So interesting. And so many people, I would imagine, while they're doing their work, think they're reinventing the wheel here, or discovering it in the first place.
Discovering it, yes.
Mhm, mhm, hmm. It made me wonder because I'm trying to think through the paradigm as I think I understand it, from the feminist viewpoint, particularly of the last, let's just say 15 years, what's been in vogue. And the way I think about it is kind of the way that I see the critiques come up in psychology, which is it was all white men, it was all straight white men. And of course, if you look into the history of psychology, yeah, a lot of the people that we lean on definitely fit that category, but it's certainly not everybody. When you're looking into the history of your field, were you seeing that, like, what was kind of in terms of researchers, what were you seeing in terms of the variation in gender, let's say?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I just recently published a preprint of a paper that is looking at this, and I'm in a couple weeks' time going to give a presentation in Sydney about this. So this journal I was telling you about, Research Quarterly, it dates back to 1930, and it is historically one of the most important journals in exercise science. But really, exercise science started out of its historical roots are in physical education, biology, and physical therapy. Those three fields predated exercise science, and them kind of coming together, along with a couple of other fields, is what led to exercise science. So, if you want to understand the history of our field, you got to go back into these archives of these journals. And I recently conducted an analysis of this very historically important journal, Research Quarterly, where I went through every single paper that they published from 1930 to 1979. And I tallied up the number of male and female participants and the number of male and female authors for every single paper. Firstly, there is a much higher degree of female participation in those studies than the current narrative would want you to know about.
Hmm.
So, if you exclude two major military studies, which had hundreds of thousands of men in them, the proportion of participants over that period of time, thousands of articles, was 40% female and 60% male. Those are the people that participated in the studies.
Hmm.
When it comes to the actual researchers, it's more male than female. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but one of the interesting things is that researcher sex and participant sex correlate. So, one of the reasons why there is more male participants is because at that time there were more male researchers, and those male researchers were very, very productive.
Hmm.
There were some guys who were just production machines. They just loved the research and they just went after it and they published. I think I tallied up the 20 most prolific authors in that journal at that time. I think 19 out of 20 were men.
Mm.
And some of these guys publishing dozens of papers. And so these are the different factors that are important in this type of, underrepresentation of women in research narratives. The context of some of those studies is that they were happening university campuses in physical education programs. And oftentimes those courses would be split by sex or gender. So what some of the researchers would do is they would just study kind of the students that are in their programs. And because the male researchers are so productive, they have access to many male students, that they are a sample of convenience.
Mm.
So this is one reason why you sometimes see historically differences in the number of male and female participants. It wasn't necessarily that people were disinterested in women. I know that's not the case in that journal, because you can see a lot of interest in the menstrual cycle and exercise and stuff. But you had these really, really productive male scientists whose sample of convenience was almost always other men.
Mm-hmm. And so, quite literally, convenience sampling. And then you have these male researchers, and they're in the context of a male milieu because they've separated them by the sexes at the time. And so they just kept generating papers, but it was predominantly based upon the sample they had available to them. I think I'm just rehashing what you just said, but I'm trying to wrestle with
Yep.
that because I think what you said before is so salient in that the history that you're referring to is the contextual nuance that was taking place in the work that maybe mainstream individuals in the cultural main are critiquing now, and they're not taking those things into account. Now, I could see an argument if I were to kind of steelman an argument for them. Maybe they could come up with an argument, although from me, it's going to be a little bit arbitrary in the sense that I don't have my own historical precedents to kind of make this critique. But I could see them making the argument being like, well, you see, that inherently proves that there was sexism going on at the time, and that's why you had these separate milieus. Therefore, the scientific rigor wasn't based on the modern metric of the equity metric, if you were to try to use that, wasn't up to par. Therefore, we have to kind of run these experiments again. Is there any veracity to that claim in essence, or is it just kind of like neither here nor there in your view?
Well, I think the way that they would come at this particular set of studies and history is, oh, well, you see, the sex of the researcher correlated with the sex of the participant.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the problem was that there was not enough women in academic roles at that time.
I see.
So that I think that would be the best way to argue that. And my reply to something like that is, well, look, this is just the natural time course of history. It doesn't mean that anything was wrong. And by the way, what did you want the male researchers to do? Did you want Richard Berger to not run all the strength training studies that he did that set basically the foundation for everything that we know now? Almost all of his participants were male university students. Did you want him to not do those studies that you now benefit from, just so that you could have had historical equal participation? And see, this is the danger of the equity narrative. And it's coming back to where we started with me challenging that equity in physical activity. It's like, yes, you know what? You can have equity, but it can come at the expense of other things. So what do you want? Did you not want all that research to be done? Because you are now benefiting from it immensely.
Can you tell me some of the ways that they are benefiting from that research?
Well, that research basically established the foundation of knowledge of strength training and its impact on health and physical function and its importance in aging and in all sorts of conditions. That is the foundational research. And it's not just strength training. It's the cardiovascular aspect of exercise, the physical fitness testing. All of that, or a majority of it, came out of this particular journal that I'm talking about. So you are now a beneficiary of that. You are an exercise science academic. Do you realize that without these giants of history, your academic position would not even exist?
Like you couldn't even make the assumption ahead of research that exercise is even beneficial to human beings, generally speaking, not just men. You wouldn't be able to actually make that cognitive leap without that research being the foundation by which you make that determination about health.
Well, to the extent that there was concern about women participating in sports and exercise, which did exist in the early 1900s, and they talk about it in this journal and other physical education journals. Basically, the position was, we think it's okay for women to participate in exercise. We're just a little bit unsure about really physically intense exercise. That's what they were not sure about. But then you see what happens is the men serve as sort of the guinea pigs in a lot of the experiments were like, oh, look, actually, we can push the human body to certain limits. We just, had this guy run on a treadmill until exhaustion and, I don't know, had a rectal probe inside his monitoring his temperature while he was doing it. And so basically what happens is we're experimenting on the men, and we're not completely like disregarding the women as participants, as I pointed out, but the men go through oftentimes the more riskier stuff. And we say, oh, okay, everyone was okay from that. Now let's try it in the women.
Mhm.
So that is some of that nuance that you're referring to that never gets discussed anymore. And partly it's because, like I said, no one goes back to read these very interesting, historically important papers.
Mm-hmm. Let's skip forward a little bit because I'm super curious. One of the other pieces, which it's kind of funny where information about you came from, because I'd actually almost expected to come from the other camps, from the people that we know. The woke nomenclature piece that you wrote actually came from the folks over at the Tin Men. Not that I would expect the Tin Men not to be aware of this, but they look into men's issues primarily. But this piece, they thought we'd have a particular interest given our kind of purview, let's say. How did you find yourself? One, what was so fascinating about it is you were using James Lindsay's dictionary, the accumulation of his knowledge on woke terminology from New Discourses, which I thought was a very interesting choice. And I'd love to understand kind of what the impetus for that paper was, and what did you find?
So as a result of the whole physical activity equity thing, I started doing more searching around, and I was I searched PubMed a lot for papers in my own field, and I just kept coming across all these ridiculous papers, all these social justice oriented papers. They seem to be just emotionalism gone crazy. I'm like, what is your actual scientific contribution here? And I just kept noticing this trend of increased numbers of these types of papers.
Mm.
So I wanted to document it. I felt like there was an accelerated increase in the number of papers being published in biomedical or health research journals that were framed in this kind of woke DEI way. So what I decided to do, the paper you're talking about, was I did keyword searches in PubMed, which is a database that's kept by the the National Library of Medicine, or the NIH.
Mm.
And I just searched for words like social justice, I don't know,
Equity.
misogyny,
Mm-hmm.
equity, health equity, gender equity, uh, even the names of
Systemic
particular.
racism, things like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even the name George Floyd, for example. How many times does George Floyd's name come up in a title or abstract of a paper in a health journal?
Mm.
So I quantified, I don't remember how many terms it was, but couple hundred, something like that. And all I did was I searched the titles and the abstracts of the articles, and then I just showed a timeline starting in, I don't know, maybe it was 1970 all the way up to when the analysis finished, which I
I
don't
think you
quite
went
remember.
as far back 1960 to 2022, if I remember correctly. I mean,
Okay,
quite a
up to 20.
range. Yeah.
And by the way, I have updated that search, and I'm going to
Mm.
publish that by the end of the year at my Substack page. And it's fascinating. And I've done it. The graphs, I think, look much nicer now. I've kind of learned from that first go. But yes, you just see around the year 2019 this accelerated use across all these different woke terms being used in the titles or abstracts of papers. So it just goes to show you that there was some sort of like critical moment there. And I think I know what most of the causes were. It was a combination of COVID, George Floyd, and then Trump being elected in 2016. And then around the time you had the COVID, and because that was, the end of the first Trump administration, then you had the upcoming election, and then you had Biden after that. So that time was a really crazy period in our history. and it correlates, with what you see with all this woke stuff coming out in the public health space. So all I did was I just quantified that for the
Mm.
historical record.
What I found fascinating was your comparison point. So you had compared terms, and keeping in mind this is one research, so it's one journal. So we're talking PubMed, and we're talking about, you were looking at things like, I think you used the word, it's just the abstract and it's just the titles, not even the body of the literature itself. And so that's something else to consider as well. But you were comparing it with what, brain, heart, and I think cancer was another term that you had used. I think there may have been one other that I saw in the paper. But the fact of the matter is in the aggregate, the woke terms that you accumulated were higher than like brain and heart, not higher than cancer. Cancer was like all the way, skyrocketed over time. It grew at a much higher rate than woke terminology, and higher than brain and heart, if I remember correctly. But woke was number 2 after you took like the aggregate of all of these concepts up until, where it ends on the tail end of the distribution or the graph at 2022. And I was just kind of like, you wrote in the piece, I think it was more than 88,000 just in 2022 alone. And I was just sitting there scratching my head at that. I hope I have that right. I'll put the paper down below for folks, or the name of the paper, if people want to go and take a look at it. But I was just like, thinking back, because one of the funny things, and not to get too personal about it, but I remember for my graduation sitting there, and during my doctoral graduation, hearing people naming their dissertation titles. And like, I don't know, these graduations are very long. We're talking several hours. And as they're naming everyone's titles over and over again, I kept hearing this kind of terminology that you kind of accumulated here, some variation of that terminology in almost every title that went by on stage. And after a while, I think I just, like, my eyes kind of glossed over, and I was just kind of like, I'll get to walk across stage eventually. In any case, I don't know if it speaks to that experience, but I think there might be anecdotally some evidence to pull from, in that even the recent graduates are completely just steeped in this kind of language and this kind of thinking.
Yeah, and well, those theses, those are going to end up being the things that are published, right? So those will be the things that I captured in my analysis. And it's not just in the articles. Of course, you see it, like if you're on a staff email list at a university and you get like a weekly newsletter from your school, you'll see it throughout all the different events that are happening on campus. You just get it from so many different angles. And for me, the accumulation of all that input I was taking in from academia was, wow, no one's tried to quantify this yet. And I think it's important, because I don't think this moment is going to continue forever. I think we're in a phase, and I think this, I was actually just talking about this the other day with one of my colleagues, and he's a little bit younger, and I was explaining to him, look, I think this is a phase, and this whole past few years of all this junk that's coming out, it will be studied historically in a kind of a sense of what the heck happened over the years. And that's the literature that I was capturing in that woke nomenclature. So I think, and the kind of the line graphs that I created in that paper, and that will come out, the updated ones that will come out by the end of the year, some of them are showing like a bit of a plateau, or at least a slowing of those previous trends. So I think we might now be somewhat correcting. I mean, it's still very problematic right now, but I do think there is a bit of a correction happening at the moment, and you should be able to see that via the keyword searches done in PubMed.
Unless the language is a shifting form and new language is being popularized, in which case you got more studies to do.
One of the interesting findings I don't know how I have it presented in that paper, but in the new graph, it's going to be presented much more clearly, which is, all of a sudden, the word equality, so starting around, I think, 2019-20, it starts to plateau in how often it's used. Meanwhile, the word equity skyrockets. So that goes to your point, which is a sort of shifting in the nomenclature from slightly different words to a new word. And I think probably we both know that that will happen if it's not already happening. But we now even have some evidence that, that's probably what that particular graph shows, is a transitioning to a new word, which people are a little bit confused about, like the general public. So yeah, we can get away, I think, with this word right now. Let's try to use it for a few more years. When it goes out of style, let's just try to create a new one and keep moving forward with our particular agenda.
Curious problem when it has a positive valence as far as people can tell, and then it means something entirely different to their usual usage of the word. We talk about that all the time, just the ability to kind of reshape and reform in any way that allows these ideas to continue to perpetuate themselves. It's
Yep.
it's certainly something to keep an eye on. Now,
Yep.
one of the other pieces that you wrote that I thought was really interesting, you were taking a look at some of the literature in terms of how, I think there were a couple scales you were taking a look at, and one of them was actually you had kind of gone into how they were being written in advance. It was like the assumptions were embedded into it as they related to men and men's privilege. And I was so curious if you recalled the piece you were referring to and what you've seen, because all these, and we talk about it at CTA as well, embedded assumptions that can show up in clinical, surveys or clinical work. It's kind of the historical or common example is like, how often do you do X? Is the assumptions already embedded in the question? What kind of things were you seeing in your research?
Yeah, so this was an essay that I wrote for Reality's Last Stand, which is
Mm,
a really great Substack page critiquing a lot of this junk in academia. And that particular essay, the title I can't remember, but it has something like rigged woke research in the title, something like
mhm.
that. And I've been reflecting about that piece a little bit more lately, and I think it's probably one of the more important things I've written this year, even though I've done a lot of different stuff. The reason for it is because it's sort of at the heart of science, the heart of academia. Um, what I have been noticing over the past few years is this concerning use of interview and focus group research to push forward an agenda rather than communicate objectively what it is that research participants are saying. So, in that essay you're talking about, there's two different kind of uh, papers that I critique, or two different areas. So the first one was a paper that came out on the concept of white ignorance.
And was that Macmillan? Is that the piece?
The Macmillan piece is the men's piece. I can
Okay,
explain that
sure, sure.
next. Yeah, so this one, it came out of, well, I think it came out of your neck of the woods, somewhere Chicago area.
Mm,
Um, and and so this piece was a interview focus group study of, even more concerningly, adolescents who were asked questions related to racism, and they were all white adolescents. And if you look at some of the focus, the limited number of actual quotes that they provided from the participants in their paper, you'll see that the kids aren't racist. They're saying, "Oh no, I don't view people based on their skin color. Nothing like that." And these were actually very encouraging responses from the kids. But instead of viewing it that way, what these researchers did is they said, look, this is evidence of their white ignorance. Look how ignorant they are of their own white supremacy. I mean, to me, that is just truly appalling to do that. Um,
mm,
so that was one piece. But
mhm,
then
mhm.
same thing is being done in kind of the men's health and feminist space. So there's another paper that I talk about, and it was an interview study of men in Canada who are involved in fathers groups. And it was a complete setup job, just like that other paper was that I just talked about. So the guys, they gave heartfelt responses to the questions they were asked to answer. They said, look, we come here sort of for solidarity. This whole notion of us as men being privileged and everything, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. Like, we feel very powerless right now. And one reason we like these fathers groups is it just gives us people to talk to and we can share our experiences. It was just the most genuine sort of thing you could ask for. And this male feminist researcher in Canada essentially took everything they said and turned it against them and said, look, this is backlash against gender equity. It's backlash against feminism. And the thing is, in both of these papers I'm referring to, you can see in the methods section, they come out and they explicitly state that prior to starting the study, they were coming in with a particular epistemological
Mhm.
lens. So they never had any intention of an inductive process where they take the responses from the participants and they just build themes upward from there. Instead, what they do is they have a pre-existing narrative, or lens as they call it, and they cram all the responses in to fit that. So not only do I think that is poor science, non-objective science, which is why I'm so concerned about this trend, but I actually think even deeper than that, it's an issue in the ethical conduct of research, because part of research ethics is basically like do no harm, right? Or minimize harm. Well, if you already know prior to the study what your conclusion is going to be, so that white ignorance exists and that these men are kind of anti-feminist problematic men, then there is no justification for you even conducting the research, because you already know what you're going to conclude. So why expose those participants to any risk of emotional harm or physical harm, depending on what type of research you do? So I think it is entirely inappropriate. And that's why I'm saying I think it's actually one of the more important things I've published this year, because I don't even think my colleagues in science who are concerned about things like they have like data integrity conferences where they're concerned about things like people using the right error bars on their line graphs and stuff. I'm like, do you guys have any idea what is happening in the humanities and how it's coming over here? They are completely trying to uproot the whole concept of objective science. So I see that as a really, really big problem right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's like inviting somebody in for something that's potentially emotionally eliciting, particularly if it's like phenomenological interviewing, and you're extrapolating from their past and kind of unfolding with them. But all the while, everything that the participant is sharing is automatically going to be assumed to be from some quality about them that's inherently negative. And it made me. I mean, do they even debrief these individuals as to the nature of the study? I mean, what are the parameters? Are they even concerned with ethicality?
I don't think that there is a debriefing, and that's and I actually mentioned that in that essay I wrote. I said, people might critique my position and say, well, it's their research; they can kind of do what they want or interpret how they want. And then you of course have experiments that are purposely deceptive in psychology. But the difference is in those studies, you are debriefed afterwards about what the purpose of the research was, why you had to do the deception. And in those studies, there is a genuine interest in identifying like the causal mechanisms
Hmm.
or the actual things from a rigorous scientific standpoint, which is why you felt like, you had to do the deception. This is completely different. This is a setup job from the very beginning. And what they're doing is they're kind of using quote unquote research as a way of kind of gaining prestige for their narrative. They say, look, we conducted a research study. It was published in the journal Child Development, or it was published in the journal Men and Masculinities. See, we're very rigorous academics. No, 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 no. It's a complete failure across the board. Those papers would have gotten peer reviewed by at least one editor and likely two peer reviewers. And so it's not just a problem of one or two researchers here and there. It is a wide ranging problem because all those papers are getting through peer review. And another concerning trend related to the ethical component of this is uh, there is some degree of question of whether some of these are ethically approved studies, like going through the institutional review board.
Mhm.
Normally, those statements are made very, very explicitly in papers. I have noticed a trend in this particular type of literature where you have to do some probing and investigating. Like that Macmillan paper, I think I explained this in the essay. I contacted the institutional review board to even see if the study was approved through the university because the author actually never said that in the paper,
Mm.
which is completely crazy because the publishers and the journals, they even have a criteria that in order to publish, you have to have ethical approval and state it in the paper. So we right now have a complete failure in academic review. We have failure at the level of the actual science. Huge problems right now.
I think I've heard individuals like Godstad and maybe even James Lindsay, bring up the issue of the publishing houses, publishers being ideologically aligned with the pieces they're publishing and therefore selectively orienting themselves to the pieces that they want to put out there. And so it's like you got the researchers who explicitly are confirming their priors while they're doing research, deceptively so, potentially not debriefing on the nature of the experiment if there is something duplicitous in the research methodology, and then risking the possibility of emotional harm, let's say, for the participants without explicit recognition as to the purpose of the study again, and then possibly sending it off for publication where the publishers themselves are allowing these things to pass because, and maybe I'm making a leap here, but maybe they're ideologically inclined to do so. I I don't know if that is me jumping too far, but I don't think that based on a lot of what's been talked about over the last couple of years, it is that much of a cognitive leap anymore. Um, it kind of made me think. I mean, what's going on inside of IRB? For instance.
Yeah,
Hmm.
well, IRB, that's a whole other issue. It's so
Did I open a
interesting.
can of worms?
Well, well, I haven't quite written about IRBs yet. But one thing that I have noticed over the years is that IRBs are becoming more like peer review prior to even doing the study. So instead of just making sure at kind of a minimal level, okay, this research, it's ethical, not going to put anyone at increased risk of harm. What I and some of my colleagues have noticed over the years is more people on IRB committees commenting on things like your methodology. So not necessarily methodology that impacts the risk to the participant, which is something that would make sense because they should be concerned with risk to the participant. That's their job. But it's more of, I'm another academic, and this is kind of a peer review process right now, like as if you were submitting your application to a journal and they're commenting on your methodology and, oh, well, why don't you have, oh, actually this is a big one. It's the sex gender stuff. It's like, oh, well, your project is designed only to study males. Well, why is that? So they're getting more kind of bureaucratic. They're getting more into things that they were never originally intended to look into. And this is problematic because there is certain research that might not get done as a result, depending on how ideologically driven the IRB committee is. They may prevent your research from ever happening in the first place, but not because necessarily of an increased risk of harm, although they might try to work that in some way as justification, but just because they don't want you to study a particular topic.
And talk about a chilling effect if people start to get that sense. I think for in graduate school, I was so concerned to look at any political phenomenon at all at the height of wokeness for a number of reasons. The atmosphere was absolutely tense with do not question the dogma as it is, kind of narratives, experiences, just didn't even need to be spoken. It was an implicit atmosphere. I recall going through IRB, and I don't think I've ever shared this with folks outside of this process, and them questioning why I needed to know our participants, if we were going to gather participants, in one iteration of going back and forth with them, why I would need to know political affiliation to understand, to better understand my research. And I remember thinking, you could have asked about all sorts of things, but this is what you kind of returned back to me. It was an odd experience because that was one that really just stood out. This was like the last gate that they waited to ask me about this one thing. In any case, you have, go ahead.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, I think what we're seeing likely happening is people not actually understanding. This gets back to the ignorance of history, not understanding what the purpose of an ethics committee or an IRB actually is. And because they don't understand that history and what its kind of boundaries are and purpose, people are getting into those roles who don't understand that. And consequently, they're looking at it from different perspectives. So they're more concerned about social justice or something. And they're like, oh, why is this guy asking a question about political affiliation? Why is this happening? So the individuals who are now serving on those committees do not even understand what the basic purpose of those IRBs is meant to be. That is the place I think we are moving into with IRBs right now.
That's like having an embedded bureaucrat. It's not like having an embedded bureaucrat. That is an embedded bureaucrat. And that's scary. You've dealt with a cancellation story, and I'd be remiss if we didn't get there in this conversation, because we've heard quite a few cancellation stories over the years, and they all shift and morph, but they follow kind of similarities and differences. Can you tell us a little bit about what's been going on in academia for you?
Yeah, so my cancellation story is unique in that it involved use of freedom of information request to provide solid evidence that I was indeed canceled for my research and research-informed views on sex and gender and my critiques of DEI. So I'll try to give you a brief summary. I've written a very extensive piece at my Substack, which has all the email communications that I was able to obtain through the Freedom of Information request. So I encourage people to read. And I go through like the history of the university and how the surrounding factors that led to the cancellation, the ideology they adopted, and all stuff. So the summary is this. From about March of 2019 to March of 2025, I was affiliated with Edith Cowan University in Perth, Australia. Over that time, I had a couple of different positions. Sometimes I was employed research staff there. And for a little while, I was not. And I was working in industry locally. But we set up an adjunct appointment for me there so that I could maintain research collaborations. I was working for a company that was making new strength training equipment. So we were going to do research, or we did research on the strength equipment in conjunction with my colleagues at ECU. Well, I eventually, after that position ended and the company now ceased to exist, I went back to the university and was working there. Okay. In March of 2025, my adjunct position, which is a non-paid position in Australia, it's just a way to stay affiliated with the university where you get the benefits that a lot of staff have. Like you get access to the digital archives of the library, you get access to software, things like that. And the benefits to the university are that the university's name goes on like everything that you publish now. And so they get money through the federal government as a result of that. So it's basically a win-win, but it's not a paid position. Okay. In March of 2025, the paid positions I had there had ended at the end of 2024, but my adjunct position was always running in the background. And it was not renewed. this was surprising because adjunct positions don't really cost them much of anything. And I was a very productive researcher, and I had ongoing collaborations with people there. But I had heard stories and things had happened to me prior to that that made me think that I was being canceled for political reasons. So I decided to submit a Freedom of Information request to the university's Strategic Governance Office, which is required by law to take on these requests. And I asked for any university communications that pertain to the decision around my adjunct position.
Mm.
And amazingly, it actually worked. So I got back a series of email communications that showed that at least as early as September 2023, so about a year and a half prior to being officially canceled, they wanted to cancel me then because of a couple of essays that I had published, which, by the way, were related to this topic of equity and physical activity and me kind of questioning the gender, sex aspect of all that and a bunch of other things. So, by the way, in my essays, I'm citing my own published papers at that time. And what you can see in the email communications is just this huge emotional response from what is likely a minority of people in the school who just couldn't handle someone challenging their orthodoxy. And in September 2023, the dean of the school, it stated explicitly in the emails that she wanted my affiliation terminated. Thankfully, someone in people and culture or like HR reminded the dean of something that we call academic freedom. And also, the dean was not even aware that at that time I was on two paid research contracts. I was actually not just adjunct at that time. I was employed staff, and the dean seemed to be completely unaware of that, which made that harder for them to cancel me then. At that time, the dean stated, okay, I'll take on your advice. We're not going to cancel this guy now, but I am not going to renew any of his future appointments. So in the emails, she stated that explicitly. So then when March 2025 came around, that's why it was not renewed. And the thing about it is, when it was not renewed in March, I asked them, I said, can you please tell me the specific reasons why this seems a bit unusual. Why was it? And they said, oh, look, this is just, university policy. We just they gave me the vaguest, most general response you can think of. They immediately cut off access to my email and all sorts of things that I outline. But the Freedom of Information request reveals they had always intended to not renew that. They were just waiting for that. So that's the summarized version of it. Please, your audience, I took a lot of time to detail everything. The emails are fascinating. If you want to understand cancel culture on campus, please read those emails.
Unbelievably fascinating and also heartbreaking, even at this point. It just still defies the imagination. And the fact that you even got access to it, as you said, is remarkable in its own right. How long did it take before you actually got access to those emails?
In Australia, by law, they are required to return the outcome, I think, it's either 4 or 6 weeks. So it's actually quite quick, all things considered. And I mostly got it back in time. The staff member that was taking care of all that in that office, I think she was actually sick for a period, and she asked me for a little bit of an extension. I said, okay, I'll give you another week, but I want this information because I don't know what the heck you guys are up to right now. But amazingly, I got 2 sets of email communications back. So the one is September 2023, but then in February of 2025, so just a month prior to my cancellation, I had published a piece at my Substack, which triggered the DEI folks at the university. And so the emails came up again, and basically the dean reiterated, look, the guy, he's coming up for renewal in March. We're just not going to renew it. But what's Michael, what's so amazing about this story is that I was never once contacted by the dean or any other ECU administrators or anything about any of this. I had no idea that they were concerned about my writing. They were also monitoring my. They also admitted that in the emails they were monitoring my social media activity as well, and they never let me defend myself. They never let me explain my views, which are published in peer-reviewed academic journals. They didn't want anything to do with it, and it gets back to what we're seeing now is this cancel culture related to kind of pointing out sex differences. And I go through that. I have a section in my Substack post called The Feminization of the Universities. And I go through the literature that we have on sort of the psychology of sex differences when it comes to um, whether you are supportive of academic cancellations, whether you're supportive of sex difference research, and this is a huge topic right now. There's been a lot published recently about this whole concept of kind of the feminization of society and stuff, and I included a little chapter in my piece about how I believe that whole kind of the feminization of the universities is actually what led to my cancellation.
Mm. Did you ever look into any of the work of like Corey Clark, for
Yep.
instance? Yeah, I remember her kind
Yes,
of talking about this years
I
ago.
cite Corey Clark's research in that section. I rely
Mm,
heavily on Corey Clark's work. Yes.
mhm. Did you ever hear from anybody from the school after? Because I'm kind of curious about two things. One, did you ever hear back from them? Talk about confirming your priors again. Never even got to speak your piece, but did you hear back from them? And then you said that you were contracted out for a couple other pieces of research. What happened with those pieces of research?
Okay, so I was never contacted by like a university official afterwards or a
Hmm.
dean or anything like that. I still have all my normal, basically my friends. Some of these people in the school, they're my friends, colleagues, and some of them will send me stuff via message or email of the drama that's still going on there. And just recently, I've heard some news stories about some people, one person in particular who was believed to be quite fundamental to my cancellation, now in a bit of drama there. And one of my colleagues is thinking about taking some action within the university because of the behavior demonstrated and all that. So there is still stuff going on there, very dysfunctional and problematic. Um, with regard to the projects I was working on, this is another fascinating aspect of this story, is that they um, demonstrated no concern whatsoever for the research that I was working on with the other ECU researchers. They didn't care about the other ECU researchers' opinions about me. I mean, obviously, we were working together and they hired me because they trust me and we have, friendship and I'm a trusted, reliable guy. They didn't care about any of that. They were willing to put at risk the university's own research, really, um, because they were so ideologically driven to cancel me. So my work on those projects essentially ended when my affiliation ended. I am still just for my own benefit and because I want to help my colleagues who are my friends. Um, I am helping tidy up some things, but that's just for free. That's just me doing it in my spare time. But yeah, I'm kind of I'm done with
Mm.
that part of my life.
If you were to talk to anybody right now, if they were to ask you, and I'm mindful of your time, and thank you so much for this conversation. I'm sorry for what you've had to go through, but I also am just so there's just so much admiration here that you stuck to your guns, and that you're kind of coming out on the other end of it. I know the last time we spoke, a lot of opportunities have kind of risen up, and you said at the beginning of the conversation, people are interested in these topics now that are so different from where you started your career, and they want to talk about what's going on in these taboo topics. They want to talk about what's going on in academia. If you were to talk to somebody who said they want to go into academia right now, and I realize this might be a loaded question in a sense, but what might you say to them?
Man, I'm not sure that the universities as they are, I don't know that they're the future. I think uh with the rise of AI, with the problematic behaviors we've seen from academia, the adoption of critical theory and all this rubbish. So I think what would need to change is employers saying, look, we no longer value the university degree, the bachelor's degree, as Google or Apple or whatever business you are. It doesn't mean anything to us anymore. Um, the power that universities have, well, that they get public funding, but they are the main credentialing system for employment. As soon as they lose that power, meaning businesses say, look, we can't trust you guys anymore. You're not credentialing the right people because you're so ideologically driven. You're not teaching them anything that's useful. So when we, as Google or Apple, we hire this person with a bachelor's degree, like they don't know anything.
Mm,
So we are going to just, I don't know, run apprenticeship programs or some other form of education where we just get the kids right out of high school and see you later, universities. Your time is gone. We now can have online education modules. So I don't know. It may depend on the specific field, but right now, I I just can't see it happening. Like the stuff that I read coming out of the universities is really troubling. Like the academic articles, it just shows a lack of objective and logical thinking.
mm.
So I don't know how that's an employable sort of person. So I would love for the universities to perhaps self correct. I'm not a huge fan of public funding of much of anything, to be honest, because I think it leads to these issues. I think probably a lot of these issues would have been corrected a long time ago or have never arisen if they didn't get all this free money, from taxpayers. Um, so I think that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. We'll see where it goes. If you have an opportunity as a young person, I don't know, to get right into a job that's pretty exciting and you think you can do your own independent education on the side, there's heaps of good content out there, like just listening to podcasts. And I think we're going to see more things like, there's sort of the Jordan Peterson Academy. There's some alternative things popping up. And I think we'll continue to see that and hopefully maybe that's what the future is.
Yeah, there does seem to be two camps arising, doesn't it? The people are trying to refurbish the enterprise, and then the people who are maybe moving away and saying, let's just come up with alternative strategies here. We've got plenty of evidence that the autodidact out in the culture can learn quite a bit if we can find a way to certify this and make it something that they can, lean back on for employers. Why not? And why not for Peterson? Why not make it more affordable? I think is kind of the marketing strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're in the middle of a change. I don't know where it's going. I'm kind of involved in it in terms of running the Nuzzo letter, my Substack page, and I'm trying to figure it all out too. And I know some of my colleagues, kind of the younger ones, who have just finished up their PhD, and they're looking around and they're like, "This academic world is just crazy." And by the way, they can't get an interview anywhere,
Mm.
and the stuff coming out is rubbish. And I think we are all just trying to figure out what is going on, where is our place right now, and yeah, hopefully, yeah, these new kind of online universities and things start to pop up, and we can all find, I don't know, some more firm ground here in the months and years to come.
Well, you're kicking up dust. We'll have to see where everything settles in the years that follow. But where can people find you? You mentioned your Substack. What's the best way to find you? And we'll put it down below as well.
Yeah, so the go-to places for me are the Nuzzo letter, which is my Substack page. And then I'm pretty active on X as well. And my handle is James L. Nuzzo.
All right. Dr. James Nuzzo. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.